Let's talk about all the ways in which assumptions show up in our conversations, our relationships, and our fights. Since I've been making assumptions and paying the price for them for years now, I'll share my stories as examples of what not to do and offer some alternative approaches. You should be warned, though, I talk about some tough topics, and some of that might be triggering for you. Because to me, I don't think it's acceptable to not talk about this stuff. Oh, I'm also a little cussy. Please take care of yourself as you listen. Make yourself comfortable, grab a snack and a drink, and let's get started. Welcome back to Confessions of a Chronic Assumer. I'm your host, Ellen Patnode, and I am, in fact, a chronic assumer. Today, we're going to talk about how assumptions and confidence are completely intertwined with each other. So we'll do that by looking at a variety of situations in how this stuff shows up in our everyday lives. Also, we'll talk about how does it hurt us and how does it hurt the people around us. We also want to look at what sort of assumptions does it reveal and what sort of assumptions does it create. And then finally, we'll end with talking about how we overcome those assumptions in order to hopefully prevent them from impacting our confidence in quite the same way that they might right now. So I think there's two key ways that assumptions actually affect our confidence. When confidence is low, we start assuming the worst, right? Get in that frame of mind where just everything is terrible. When our confidence is high, we risk assuming that we already know all the answers, what's needed, that we know everything, right? And neither one of those situations is optimal because both of them are at an extreme and they have impacts on us. It's a little bit of a chicken and an egg scenario, actually. Is our confidence being impacted by the assumptions that we're making? Or are our assumptions being informed by our level of confidence? And the answer is it's both. That's the beauty of this stuff, is that it's so pervasive and intrinsic to how we communicate with each other that it's impossible to isolate any one factor. So let's talk about some different situations where this kind of stuff shows up and see if we can pick apart a little bit what's happening, how it's hurting us, and where do we go from here. So let's start with a work example. In my younger working life, when I was a community organizer, I started in that job and my confidence was relatively low. Partly because if you tuned into episode 1, you might remember me telling you that people assumed I had slept my way into that job. They didn't understand what a young white girl would be doing in an urban area working with lots of Black and brown people to help them think about social justice. It didn't make sense to them. So they made assumptions about why I was there. So right out the gate, I showed up feeling like I had something to prove. And because my personality and hardwiring are what they are, me having a lack of confidence, feeling like I've got to show my value means I show up with an agenda. I am determined to convince people that I'm worthy of being at the table, being part of the conversation. And so it causes me to show up in a way that I'm looking for those opportunities. So I'm sitting in this meeting, one of the early meetings that I had. This was faith-based community organizing. So there were churches that were members of our organization. So I went to a meeting at one of these churches. I remember sitting in the basement of this church with a group of leaders, and a more seasoned organizer was introducing me to this group for the first time. I was the only white person in the room, which in and of itself wasn't uncomfortable given where I came from, how I grew up. That wasn't the part that was uncomfortable. What was uncomfortable was that I wasn't really sure what their agenda was. I wasn't sure how I was going to possibly contribute to that conversation. And so I just immediately started what I call panic listening in my head, which means I wasn't actually listening to what they were saying. I was hearing the conversation, but what I was listening for was an opportunity to say something that would prove I was credible and belonged at the table. So that meant that when I finally did interject into the conversation, it didn't really do anything to add value to the conversation or further what they were trying to do. It instead was like, hey, look at me, look at me, look at me. I'm so important and smart and I know what I'm doing. And so I totally belong at this table. Thank you for having me here, which was a bit of a disaster. The effect that it had was that it hurt my credibility terribly. And worse, which was better in the long run, but absolutely worse in the moment, was that I was called out. One of the women sitting at the table pushed her glasses down and looked at me over the top of them like this and was like, hey, what's the matter with you? We do not care about your experience in Detroit. We do not care where you have come from. We only care how you can help us move further ahead. Ouch. It was a very painful moment for me. I was horribly embarrassed. I started sputtering an apology. I felt very scolded. What I came to later realize was what a gift that was. Her willingness to give me that feedback in the moment helped me understand I needed to pull it together. I needed to regroup and figure out different ways that I could show up and add value to conversations, and that all of that stuff wasn't about me. In another situation, let's think about our personal relationships, because this stuff shows up there too, right? So when I'm under a lot of stress, I feel like all of those messages from my early life about being too much and being too loud and over the top, all that shit comes raining down on me full force when I'm stressed out. And it causes me to make assumptions about what people in my life want to hear, what they don't want to hear. And so I start assuming, well, my friends are not going to want to hear about how stressed out I am, right? My confidence takes a dip. And again, it's hard to figure out which one actually happened first. Did my confidence dip first, or did my assumptions come into play first, which caused my confidence to dip? Who knows? The point is both are present, right? My confidence is low and I'm making assumptions that my friends don't want to hear from me. They don't want to hear about all my stress. My best friend is somebody who sees the world very differently than I do in some respects. Her personality and hardwiring are completely opposite of mine. And so sometimes the advice that she gives me is like, I would never do that. I would never say that. I would never avoid the situation in that way. So I make assumptions about what sort of advice I'm going to get. If I do call up a friend and say, gosh, I'm so stressed right now, I just need to vent. But more often it just causes me to retreat. My confidence is low. I assume nobody wants to hear from me, or that they're going to tell me that I'm wrong, that I'm looking at it the wrong way, or that I should be doing something I don't want to do. And so I just withdraw. And that causes me to isolate into myself. And then I become even more miserable because those messages just start becoming even louder and more self-defeating. And pretty soon I'm bitter towards this group of people who love me, but who I'm assuming don't want anything to do with me because I'm stressed out right now, right? So it comes up and hurts me in all kinds of ways, and probably hurts the relationship too, when they realize that I've been suffering in silence and I didn't even give them a chance. I didn't give them the opportunity to be there for me or to try to take care of me. Another situation where I found this really popped up a lot was while I was caregiving. My mother had a really aggressive and nasty form of dementia called Lewy body dementia. And it's the second most common type of dementia, actually, but Alzheimer's is the type of dementia that most of us are more familiar with. And it's often portrayed as the long goodbye, because the effect that the disease has on the brain is this like slow chipping away to the person affected by it. And so it's called the long goodbye because we just watch them slowly fade and slip away, and it's a very steady and slow decline. Lewy body, on the other hand, is like being caught on the most hellish, nightmarish roller coaster you can imagine with no way off. It's up and down. No 2 days are the same. It's very unpredictable. So I'm surrounded by people in my caregiving group and in my life who are familiar with the long goodbye version of dementia, who are sort of like talking about their experience, and it's so vastly different from my own experience that my confidence starts to dip. I start to assume, well, I'm like gaslighting myself. Maybe I'm interpreting it incorrectly. Maybe that's not really what's happening. Or worse, I feel like, oh my God, I really don't know what I'm doing. Look at, they're talking about all these strategies that they're using for their experience. And I can't imagine any of those strategies being effective for my situation. So I must be doing it wrong. My mom must be right. I must be doing it all wrong. So sometimes these messages they get into this vicious cycle on repeat in our heads. And before we know it, we're making assumptions about, I made assumptions that I was a bad person, that something was wrong with me, that I was the only one who was living this kind of experience. It caused me, again, to isolate myself even further. It caused my confidence to dip even lower. And it prevented me from being able to engage with more compassion with my mom in my actual caregiving role because I didn't have an outlet. I didn't have a release. I wasn't taking advantage of the releases that were there, like through the support group or through other resources and workshops, because I was shaming myself into believing that I was doing it all wrong. So again, confidence, assumptions, which one came first? I don't know, but they certainly played off of each other, right? So how do we overcome this stuff? How do we overcome the assumptions affecting our confidence? And how do we make sure we aren't going from the negative effects of low confidence into assumption land, right? How do we make sure that, and also how do we make sure that we're not crossing over from low confidence into being overly confident? Because that can introduce a whole other set of challenges. Let me give you an example of that. I was younger in my career. I was working with a government agency, with a team from a government agency. And I could tell that the way the conversation was going in the room, they were not, it was staying at a very superficial level, right? There were a lot of things that needed to be said that weren't being said. And I was overly confident in my ability to help them have that hard conversation. I thought that's all they need. They just need a little push. They just need some encouragement to dive right in, have that hard conversation. So I actually set aside my presentation and I put my hands on the table and I leaned over toward them and I said, listen, I can tell from your reactions that what we're talking about is keeping this at a very superficial level. And I'm pretty sure there's a deeper conversation that needs to be had. And I got a couple of nods of agreement. There was some frustration in the room. People started saying, yeah, that would be good. So I said, great, let's just set this aside and let's have a real conversation. I had no idea what the fuck I was doing. I had no idea how to help them navigate that conversation. I had no clear picture of where they needed to get to. There were so many things about what needed to happen that I didn't know, but my sense of overconfidence caused me to just barrel right on through anyway. And the result is eventually we reached the time limit of the meeting. Nothing was resolved. I'm fairly confident I did not add a lot of value to that dynamic. And the team left with some people really angry and nothing much resolved. So being overly confident can also impact us in fairly negative ways. Whichever one it is, whether you're being overly confident or you're having a crisis of confidence, even if it's momentary, I think some of the strategies of ways we can think about overcoming those effects are still the same. First and foremost, I'm a big fan of self-talk. Take a deep breath, ground yourself, say kinder things to yourself, not over into the arrogant category. I'm not a fan, at least I don't think it's an effective strategy. the people who are like, I'm the best, I'm the greatest ever, and they sort of pump themselves up in that way, I think we risk becoming a bit too arrogant when we do that. So I'm not a fan of that. But I am a fan of thinking about, what are you saying to yourself? What are you believing about your capacity? Because we're usually much harder on ourselves. We're our own worst critics than other people are. So if we just think, would I say this to my best friend? Would I say this to my child? If the answer is no, you should not be saying it to yourself. So some self-talk that grounds us a little bit, and just gives us a moment to just find our bearings. That can have the benefit of viewing the situation we're going into very differently. Another strategy for making sure that we're not allowing confidence to dictate the assumptions that we're making, or vice versa, is to make sure we're entering situations where we're listening to understand, not listening to talk. We're not just waiting for our opportunity to chime in, but instead we're listening to really understand. And that looks differently for different people. Some people are able to simply sit, look at the person that's talking, and truly make their mind be quiet and just listen. For other people, a strategy that can be effective is take some notes while you're listening. Jot down key words, type the things that are being said. Any method to anchor yourself in that moment, that's a strategy other people find effective. Whatever it is, listen to understand, not just listen to talk or be able to add something to the conversation. That's another strategy for overcoming and finding that balance. Also, think about what it is that you need and be prepared to ask for it. I think that if you're overcoming a lack of confidence that a friend wants to hear you unload, for example, start by asking if it's okay. So if I call my best friend up and say, or I send her a message and say, hey, I am having just a shit day from hell. You would not believe all the things that are going on. I would really benefit from venting about it. Is that okay? Are you available? Are you having the kind of day that allows you to just let me unload for a little while? Because I really need to unload. And then be prepared to accept their answer. Because if it's not a good time, they're busy, whatever, don't take that as a personal attack. Go back to the self-talk point. Don't take it as a personal attack. Instead, understand that it's not about you. It's a reflection of where they are in that moment. And try the next person on your list that might be able to create that space for you. If you're in a work situation and you're not sure how to add value to a meeting or a conversation, ask for clarity. Where are we trying to get to by the end of this meeting today? What's the goal for this conversation? Because if you can get some clarity about that, it might become more obvious to you where you might be able to interact in a way that will add value. And then also, if you think you're the only one experiencing something, like I was with the caregiving situation, ask if that's true. And even if it is, even if you are the only one that's struggling in the way that you are, ask what insights somebody that's outside of the situation might have that could help you. The more open we can be to other people's insights and opinions and perspectives, the more we begin to open up our own minds. And that can be a confidence boost because it can help you feel less alone. Even if they haven't walked the same path that you've walked, just their willingness to be invested in you enough that they're giving you their perspective and sharing their ideas can be a bit of a confidence boost. And then lastly, check yourself. Check yourself in the moment. If you are, if you're showing up in a way that you know is reflecting the worst of yourself because you're in that moment of crisis of confidence, apologize for it. Say, listen, I'm having a rough day at the moment. I'm really struggling here. And check in with the person that you're talking to. Be willing to ask some more questions. Remember that communication works best when we remember that it's consensual. Ask for permission along the way. Check in with the other person along the way. Make sure that you're being heard the way that you want to be heard, understood the way that you want to be understood. And when that's not happening, don't be afraid to go back and adjust. The more we're willing to do that, the more authentically we're showing up with each other, the more we're going to minimize those assumptions and not damage our own level of confidence in the process. Thanks for joining me today. I hope that you'll come back next time. We're going to talk about how assumptions affect how we show up and how we read the room when we show up. Until then, please connect with me on all the socials. You can find me on LinkedIn at Ellen Patnode, and you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Patnode Coaching. And just remember, as the wise old Albert Einstein said, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is the definition of insanity. We've got to be willing to do different to get different. Have a great week.